What if the most brilliant minds can be manipulated, and the most meticulously planned crimes are just part of a larger, unseen game? The story begins in the foggy streets of London with a famous diplomat's mysterious disappearance and a single, cryptic telegram. The police hit a dead end, but a genius detective, Miss Sayers, senses a deeper plot. As she uncovers the first clue, it vanishes. A murder follows, then another, and the killer leaves a taunting note. "You're slower than I expected. Catch me if you can." Just when Sayers believes she has cornered the culprit, the final twist reveals a mastermind pulling the strings from the shadows. Someone who is not only a killer, but a phantom, a true villain. This isn't just a detective story, it's a psychological battle of wits where every detail, every move, is a deliberate part of a grand design. Can Sayers outsmart a genius who controls the very fabric of the investigation? Watch to the end to discover the shocking truth behind the mastermind's twisted game. The night was unusually still over London, a heavy fog curling through the gaslit streets, muffling the clatter of carriage wheels and the distant bark of a lone dog. In a small, well-to-do neighborhood of Kensington, the residents slept uneasily. Unaware that a crime of curious precision and baffling nature had just occurred at the home of Sir Reginald Harcourt, a retired diplomat known for his meticulous habits and sharp mind. The household staff had discovered him missing in the early hours, and the room he had occupied showed no sign of struggle, no broken locks, no forced entry. Only a single, peculiar clue that would confound even the most experienced investigators: a telegram, left neatly folded atop his mahogany writing desk. Its content was cryptic, almost absurd in its simplicity, a single line reading, "The hour of reckoning has arrived. Seek where shadows rest." Inspector Charles Blythe of Scotland Yard arrived at the Harcourt residence shortly after dawn. He was a competent officer, seasoned by years of criminal investigations, yet even he felt a subtle unease in the air as he surveyed the study. The telegram, with its deliberate ambiguity, seemed designed to frustrate rather than inform. "No one has seen Sir Reginald since last evening?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with concern. The housekeeper, Mrs. Elspeth Brindle, wrung her hands nervously. "No, sir. He had his usual dinner at 7, then retired to his study. I checked at 10. And he was there reading some papers. But by midnight gone. There was no note, no sign of struggle, only this." She gestured toward the telegram, her voice quivering slightly. Blythe examined the room with meticulous care. The windows were locked from the inside, the door latched, and the fireplace untouched since it had last been swept. The furniture was arranged precisely as Sir Reginald had left it. The books on the shelves aligned with geometric precision, yet the detective's trained eye could detect a subtle disturbance. A faint smear of mud on the otherwise immaculate Persian rug led to the bay window, where the brass latch bore tiny, almost imperceptible scratches. "Curious," Blythe murmured. "This suggests either an inside job or someone exceptionally skilled at leaving no trace." He pocketed the telegram, turning it over in his hands as he considered its implications. The wording was deliberately theatrical, almost as though the sender wished to mock anyone who might try to solve the puzzle. As Blythe continued his examination, he noted the clock on the mantel. It had stopped precisely at 11:47 p.m. That alone was not unusual in a house with old mechanisms, yet in combination with the telegram, it struck him as potentially significant. He jotted the time in his notebook, aware that small, seemingly trivial details often proved the key in the most perplexing cases. He questioned Mrs. Brindle about the household staff, who had all retired early due to an unexpected downpour that evening, and each one confirmed they had seen nothing unusual. Even the neighborhood, typically lively with late-night promenaders, had been silent, wrapped in fog and an unnatural calm that seemed almost conspiratorial. The inspector then turned his attention to Sir Reginald himself, poring over what was known of the man's habits. A disciplined bachelor with an appreciation for order, he had no enemies, no debts, and no known conflicts with colleagues from his diplomatic past. His life was a pattern of regularity: early morning walks, late-night correspondence, and weekly social calls to close acquaintances. Yet, Blythe knew better than to assume that a life so orderly could not conceal hidden tensions. Sometimes, the most perplexing crimes sprang from the quietest lives. Returning to the telegram, Blythe considered its phrasing. "Seek where shadows rest." Could it be literal or figurative? He examined the study for shadowed corners, hidden compartments, or overlooked spaces. Behind a large, velvet-curtained window, he found nothing. Beneath the rug, nothing. Yet in the subtle gap between the bookcases and the wall, there was a faint draught, a whisper of air that suggested a concealed passage or a vent. He noted it for further investigation, though he did not reveal his suspicion to Mrs. Brindle, who watched him with mounting anxiety. Hours passed with the detective meticulously combing the residence, taking measurements, sketching diagrams, and cross-referencing timelines. The telegram, however, remained an enigma. Blythe reflected on the wording again and again, recognizing the duality of the messages simple enough to be ignored, yet loaded with potential significance for someone trained to read between the lines. Whoever had sent it was clever, anticipating the initial confusion it would create. Blythe's instincts told him the clue was not meant to mislead entirely, but to guide subtly, as a chess master leaving a trail for the patient player who could anticipate every move. By late afternoon, the fog had begun to lift, sunlight spilling over the cobbled streets and illuminating the front of the Harcourt residence. Still, Sir Reginald had not been found. Blythe's thoughts turned to the practicalities of the disappearance. Had the man left of his own accord, or had he been taken? A self-imposed absence seemed unlikely given his precise nature. Yet abduction seemed equally improbable. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, no noise that could have alerted neighbors. The puzzle deepened with every passing hour. Blythe called in a few close associates of Sir Reginald, friends and acquaintances whose impressions might reveal subtle details about his recent behavior. Lady Amelia Worthing, a long-time friend, mentioned that Sir Reginald had been particularly contemplative in recent days, frequently speaking in metaphors about time running out and the weight of shadows. Blythe's mind clicked. Could these remarks connect to the telegram? The detective began to suspect a personal motive, an intricate riddle meant to be solved by someone who truly understood Sir Reginald's habits and thoughts. As evening approached, Blythe returned to the study one last time, examining the room from every angle. A faint smell of tobacco lingered near the fireplace, though the logs had not been touched. A chair was slightly misaligned, almost imperceptibly from the precise geometry of the room. And then, at the corner of the desk, something caught his eye: a small, almost invisible scratch on the surface, like a mark made by a sharp instrument. Blythe leaned closer, realizing that this might indicate a mechanism, a secret drawer, perhaps, or a concealed compartment. His pulse quickened. The mystery was far from unsolvable. It had been waiting for the right eyes to uncover its hidden architecture. Outside, the first stars emerged in the night sky as Blythe, deep in thought, pondered the puzzle. The crime, seemingly simple in its execution, yet maddening in its implications, was a test of intellect, patience, and perception. Whoever had orchestrated it had designed a maze of subtle clues, each intended to misdirect and provoke frustration. Yet, Blythe felt a growing confidence that the threads of the mystery were aligning. The telegram, the undisturbed room, the stopped clock, and the whisper of air from the walls, all these elements were pieces of a larger design. By the end of the night, Inspector Blythe had mapped the study meticulously, noting every anomaly, every imperfection, and every subtle sign. Though Sir Reginald remained missing, the detective's mind had begun to see the outlines of a solution. The case, while baffling, was not without logic. It was a riddle, layered and deliberate. A testament to the intelligence of both the missing diplomat and the mind that would seek to uncover him. As Blythe left the residence, the fog settling around his coat like a cloak of secrecy, he knew that the investigation had only just begun. But the first crucial step had been taken, recognizing that no detail was too small, no clue too obscure, and no room too orderly to hide the truth. In that quiet Kensington street, beneath the watchful stars and the lingering fog, the unsolvable crime waited, its resolution hidden in shadows, its secrets resting in the mind of a detective willing to see beyond the obvious. The telegram, absurd yet pointed, remained a beacon, challenging the limits of observation and intellect, inviting Blythe to step fully into the labyrinth of mystery that had claimed Sir Reginald Harcourt. The following morning, the streets of Kensington were lighter, the fog replaced by a pale, hesitant sun that barely penetrated the grey veneer of the city. Inspector Blythe, though diligent, knew that routine police measures would only yield surface-level observations. It was time to call in someone whose reputation for meticulous observation preceded him. Dorothy Sayers arrived quietly at the Harcourt residence, a figure of composed curiosity, her sharp eyes scanning the exterior before she even entered. She carried little more than a notebook and a steady confidence that seemed to render the ordinary details of the house suddenly significant. Blythe greeted her with measured respect. "Inspector Blythe," she said simply, "I understand you've encountered something unusual." Inside the study, Sayers immediately took in the room as though seeing it for the first time. Her gaze lingered on the telegram, now laid out atop the polished desk, then traced the furniture's precise alignment, the undisturbed carpet, and the faint scratch at the corner of the desk that had caught Blythe's attention the night before. She crouched, peering at the floor where the thin smear of mud led to the bay window. "Interesting," she murmured. "This mark isn't random. Someone deliberately avoided leaving additional traces, though even the most careful hand leaves whispers." Blythe raised an eyebrow. "Whispers?" She smiled faintly, pointing at the uneven angle of a single chair. "Subtle displacements often speak louder than overt signs of struggle. They are the breadcrumbs of an intelligent perpetrator." Her attention then shifted to the telegram. Sayers turned it over in her hands. Noting the sharp creases and the precise folds, the way the paper's fibers had caught faintly in one corner. "It was folded with care," she said. "Not by someone in a rush, but by someone confident in their control over time and attention. Whoever left this is used to being noticed, and to manipulating perception." Blythe nodded. He had suspected cleverness, but her observation lent it nuance. He hadn't considered intention layered atop theatricality. Sayers' gaze wandered next to a faint draft near the wall behind the bookcase. She crouched again, running her fingers lightly along the baseboards. Her brow furrowed. "This is more than a simple gap. There's a change in the wood's texture, a subtle misalignment. Likely a concealed panel or vent, something designed to be overlooked. A detail easily missed by routine inspection." Blythe felt a flicker of anticipation. He had noted it, but had not considered it could be an entryway or hiding place. "You believe he could have used it?" she asked, her eyes glinting with curiosity. "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps the telegram is guiding us here." Their examination was interrupted by a nervous cough. It was Mrs. Brindle, holding a tray of tea. Sayers observed her closely as the housekeeper entered, noting the slight tremor in her hands and the way her eyes darted to the desk before returning to the floor. "A reaction," Sayers whispered to Blythe. "Small, but telling. Notice how her gaze avoids the telegram once she sees we've handled it. She knows more than she says, or fears the implications of her knowledge." Blythe leaned in. "Do you suspect she's hiding something?" Sayers shook her head subtly. "Not hiding. Protecting. Fear can distort perception without corrupting honesty. We must tread carefully. The truth sometimes lurks behind the instinct to shield rather than deceive." Sayers then moved to the bay window, examining the latch with her gloved hands. The scratches were faint but intentional, aligned with a mechanism that suggested manipulation rather than accident. She tugged gently, feeling the subtle resistance of a spring hidden beneath the frame. "See this," she said. "It's designed to appear untouched. A skilled hand, someone familiar with carpentry or mechanical devices, the perpetrator, or perhaps Sir Reginald himself, knew how to make entry or exit invisible to an untrained eye." Blythe considered her words. "Could he have staged his own disappearance?" he asked. Sayers' expression was unreadable. "It's a possibility. But the telegram implies a game designed for someone else to play. If he intended to vanish, he wouldn't leave such a provocative invitation. He wants to be found, but only by someone capable of seeing what others miss." As they continued, Sayers' attention was drawn to the fireplace. The logs were untouched, but the faint scent of tobacco lingered. She knelt, inspecting the hearth carefully. Between the bricks, a thin layer of soot had been disturbed. "These marks are deliberate," she said, brushing the soot lightly with a fingertip. "A subtle signal. Perhaps to indicate a hiding place or a starting point for the next clue. The hand that left this wants to be followed, but cautiously. The puzzle is layered, not linear." Blythe followed her reasoning, recognizing the precision in her observations. The crime was not just an act. It was a narrative. An intellectual challenge, orchestrated with intention at every turn. The day wore on, the sunlight waning and shadows stretching across the room. Sayers meticulously examined every corner, every surface. She paused at the desk, noticing something Blythe had missed entirely. A tiny fragment of paper lodged in the seam of the drawer. "Small," she murmured, "almost invisible. A torn edge, like it was deliberately left. Not evidence of carelessness, but of intentional misdirection." She extracted it carefully and unfolded it, revealing a fragment of handwriting that was barely legible. It read, "Not everything is what it seems. Seek the," and then the rest was obscured. "An incomplete message," Sayers said. "A hint. Whoever wrote this wanted it to be found, but only partially. It's a test of attention, patience, and discernment." Blythe was struck by her insight. Where routine procedures might have catalogued the room and recorded the obvious, Sayers' scrutiny revealed the subtle narrative, embedded in every detail: the misaligned chair, the faint scratches on the window, the scent of tobacco, the dust on the hearth, the fragment of a note, all woven into a sequence designed to communicate with an observant mind. And yet, the full picture remained frustratingly incomplete, a puzzle whose pieces were scattered across perception rather than physical space. Before leaving the study, Sayers paused at the telegram once more, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "This is not merely a clue to a disappearance," she said quietly. "It is an invitation to reasoning. The author, Sir Reginald or another, is challenging the observer to navigate his world with care. Deception may be present, but only to the degree that it tests intellect. The key is not panic or force, but patience and observation." Blythe nodded, the weight of her reasoning settling over him. It was clear now that this investigation required more than standard police work. It demanded insight, intuition, and the ability to read between layers of intention. As dusk fell, the two detectives stepped onto the quiet street, the air cool and heavy with the scent of rain from the previous night. Their eyes, trained differently, but aligned in purpose, turned back toward the Harcourt residence, each detail they had noted coalescing into a growing awareness. This was no ordinary crime. It was a carefully orchestrated challenge, with subtle misdirections and deliberate signals, where the smallest observation could illuminate paths invisible to the untrained eye. Somewhere within the carefully curated environment of the house, the truth lay waiting, and with every subtle clue uncovered, Sayers felt the pattern begin to emerge. The city around them remained calm. Yet the tension of possibility clung to the walls and foggy streets. Each movement within the Harcourt home, the shifting of air in hidden compartments, the quiet creak of an undisturbed floorboard, could conceal a revelation, and Sayers was determined to see it. The first signs of deception had begun to appear, though their meaning remained tantalizingly out of reach. The game had begun, and she was fully prepared to follow the threads wherever they led, guided by a mind trained to notice what others consistently overlooked. The following morning brought a grey, persistent drizzle over Kensington, lending the streets a slick, reflective quality that mirrored the uncertainty of the case. Inside the Harcourt residence, the atmosphere was taut, almost electric. As Sayers prepared to begin her interviews with those present the night of Sir Reginald's disappearance, Inspector Blythe had already assembled a list of potential witnesses, household staff, a few close friends, and neighbors who had glimpsed Sir Reginald on his last known walk. Sayers began with Mrs. Brindle, whose nervous comportment yesterday had hinted at more than mere domestic concern. Seated across from the housekeeper, Sayers noticed immediately the tension in her posture, the fingers entwined tightly, a foot tapping intermittently, eyes darting toward the desk as though expecting some invisible signal. "Mrs. Brindle," Sayers said softly, "I need you to recount the evening of the telegram's arrival, exactly as you remember it." Mrs. Brindle's voice wavered, smooth in places but breaking slightly when she mentioned Sir Reginald's demeanor. He was anxious, yes, but polite. He received a telegram, and then he went upstairs. She hesitated, glancing toward the study. Sayers leaned slightly forward, not pressing, simply observing. "What happened after he went upstairs?" Sayers asked, her tone patient yet insistent. The housekeeper swallowed hard. I made tea. As usual, I thought he would come down shortly. Then I heard nothing. Her words seemed straightforward, yet something in her avoidance of specifics. What exactly she had done while waiting, whether she had seen anyone else, triggered Sayers' suspicion. Subtle inconsistencies, she reminded herself, often spoke louder than outright confessions. Next came the gardener, Mr. Penrose, a man of large build and deliberate speech. He recounted seeing Sir Reginald walking in the garden that evening, umbrella in hand, head bent against the drizzle. "Did you notice anyone else nearby?" Sayers asked. He shook his head firmly, adding that he had seen no one else on the property. Yet when she inquired about the garden gate, he hesitated, frowning slightly. "Well, it was slightly open, but I didn't think it was important." Sir Reginald often left it that way. Sayers made a note. Minor discrepancies, even in seemingly irrelevant details, could reveal far more than outright lies. The interview with the neighbor, Mrs. Aldridge, provided a different texture of narrative. She was eager, almost too eager, to provide information. Describing Sir Reginald's evening in excruciating detail, how he had hummed a tune, how he paused by the rose bushes, even his choice of coat buttons. Yet the meticulousness itself was suspicious. Sayers observed her closely, noting the subtle shifts in expression whenever she mentioned Sir Reginald's mood. "It is wonderful you remember so much," Sayers remarked. "But are you certain your memory is not influenced by expectation?" The neighbor's eagerness faltered, a small flicker of irritation crossing her features before she masked it with a polite smile. The diversity of accounts began to form a complex mosaic. Some witnesses held back, fearful perhaps of revealing inconvenient truths. Others seemed desperate to impress, to show that they were attuned to Sir Reginald's movements. Sayers recognized the patterns immediately, the contradictions, the omissions, the over-precise recollections. Each voice was a filter through which the truth had been refracted, and the detective knew she had to untangle them with care. One particular contradiction stood out during the interview with the butler, Mr. Hawthorne, who claimed to have last seen Sir Reginald around 7:30 p.m. on the ground floor. The telegram, however, bore a timestamp of 9:45 p.m., suggesting Sir Reginald had been somewhere else when it was received. "Are you certain of the time, Mr. Hawthorne?" Sayers asked quietly, watching for a reaction. His eyes flickered to the clock on the mantel, a nervous tick betraying his otherwise impeccable composure. I am confident," he said, though the edge of doubt was unmistakable. Sayers made another note. Each discrepancy, no matter how small, could be a deliberate obfuscation, or a mistake born of memory under stress. The day stretched on, and Sayers moved from one witness to another, piecing together overlapping stories. The family's solicitor, Mr. Carrington, provided the most curious account of all. He claimed that Sir Reginald had appeared agitated earlier in the day, muttering about obligations and unfinished letters. Yet when questioned about the telegram specifically, he seemed to pivot, offering vague speculation rather than first-hand knowledge. Sayers' instincts told her that the solicitor's evasiveness was not mere forgetfulness. Some motivation, perhaps connected to inheritance or reputation, lingered behind the polished exterior. During the interviews, Sayers' attention returned repeatedly to the fragment of the telegram found in the desk drawer. Its partial warning, combined with the witnesses' varying accounts, suggested an orchestrated puzzle rather than a straightforward disappearance. The detective sensed that someone was manipulating the narratives, guiding some witnesses toward exaggeration, encouraging others toward omission. Each interview became a test of observation, requiring her to read not just the words but the silences, the micro-expressions, the subtle shifts of body language. By late afternoon, Sayers convened with Inspector Blythe in the study once more, spreading the compiled notes across the polished desk. "These contradictions," she said, pointing to the timeline inconsistencies, "they're not random. They are carefully curated misdirections. Someone intends for us to be led down multiple paths at once, hoping we will accept one story as truth." Blythe leaned back, rubbing his temple. But who would benefit from such confusion? Sayers considered this, her gaze drifting to the faint scratch on the bay window again, to the dust patterns on the hearth, and to the fragment of paper that still hinted at the rest of the message. Someone with intimate knowledge of the household and of the people within it. Someone who knows the dynamics of attention, fear, and trust. Someone who believes they are clever enough to mask their hand entirely. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Brindle, returning with a small, sealed envelope she claimed had been found slipped under the study door that morning. Sayers examined it carefully. No handwriting, no postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words typed with mechanical precision. Observe more than the obvious. The first truth lies where attention hesitates. Sayers held it delicately between two fingers, a slight frown marking her features. The message reinforced her earlier instincts. The clues were layered, hidden in plain sight. And each witness's version of events was itself a part of the puzzle. As dusk approached, the detective moved to the window once more, considering the garden. The path, the faint traces of movement she had noted the previous day. Every word spoken today, she murmured to Blythe, is both revelation and camouflage. The witnesses' voices are like brush strokes. Some highlight, some obscure. To see the full picture, we must read between them all, discern the intention behind hesitation and embellishment. Blythe nodded silently, understanding the gravity of her deduction. By nightfall, the threads of narrative had begun to weave together into something approaching coherence, yet the final form remained elusive. Each witness had offered a perspective, a truth filtered through fear, loyalty, or desire to manipulate. Each small contradiction, every subtle emphasis or omission, hinted at a deeper scheme. Sayers felt the tension in the house. A quiet anticipation that whispered of secrets not yet revealed, of motives lying beneath the carefully maintained facade of civility. Somewhere within these overlapping narratives, the ultimate deception awaited discovery, and Sayers' mind, attuned to the minutiae others overlooked, began tracing the contours of the truth that had been deliberately hidden in plain sight. The night deepened over Kensington, casting long shadows across the Harcourt estate, and within the study, Sayers leaned over her scattered notes with a meticulous intensity. Each witness had offered fragments of a story, yet the fragments seemed designed to mislead, overlapping in some places while conspicuously silent in others. She sipped her tea slowly, letting the steam mingle with the sharp scent of ink and polished wood, while her mind traced the invisible connections between people, places, and events. There was a pattern forming, faint but undeniable, and at its core lay motive. Sir Reginald, she reminded herself, was a man of both wealth and influence, and those two qualities alone ensured that anyone close to him might harbor an interest in his fate. She began with the household staff. Mrs. Brindle's nervousness suggested more than duty, perhaps a fear of exposure. Mr. Hawthorne, the butler, had faltered when pressed about the timeline, and Mr. Penrose, the gardener, seemed unaware of the gate's slight ajar, yet Sayers suspected he had noticed more than he admitted. Greed might have whispered in each of their ears, yet fear and loyalty intertwined with it, producing subtle contradictions that could not be ignored. The solicitor, Mr. Carrington, presented another layer entirely. His evasiveness regarding the telegram, paired with his insistence on Sir Reginald's agitated state earlier that day, hinted at knowledge he was unwilling to admit. Sayers considered the implications. If Carrington had known something about Sir Reginald's affairs, perhaps an impending will revision or a confidential contract, he might have had more than professional concern motivating his obfuscation. And then there were the neighbors, especially Mrs. Aldridge, whose eagerness bordered on performance, as if she were crafting herself a role in the narrative. Jealousy, perhaps, or a desire to influence the investigation subtly. Sayers moved systematically through her observations. She began mapping alibis against opportunities. Mr. Hawthorne claimed to have been on the ground floor around the time of the telegram. Yet the note's timestamp contradicted his account. Could he have intercepted the message or altered the scene? Mrs. Brindle's testimony held gaps during the crucial minutes after the telegram arrived. She might have witnessed something she dared not disclose. Mr. Penrose, with his casual mention of the garden gate, may have seen someone enter or leave the property unnoticed. The house, once a place of order and routine, now felt like a stage for clandestine movements, each actor performing a carefully measured part. Financial entanglements could not be ignored. Sir Reginald's recent investments had been a topic of discreet discussion among the household, and whispers of inheritance disputes had circulated quietly in the drawing rooms and hallways. Sayers considered the possibility that greed had motivated more than one individual. A sudden wind rattled the windows, and she imagined the various ways access to the house, to the study, and even to Sir Reginald himself could be exploited. Each suspect had opportunity, but opportunity alone was insufficient without motive. Yet in this house, motive proliferated like shadows in the corners of the rooms. The relationships between staff and family added further complexity. Mrs. Brindle had worked for the Harcourts for decades, her loyalty intertwined with knowledge of every household secret. The butler, Hawthorne, carried a quiet authority that made him both indispensable and potentially dangerous if pressed. Even Mr. Penrose's seemingly peripheral position allowed for unexpected observation. A man in the right, or wrong, place at the right moment could alter the course of events with nothing more than silence or deception. Sayers began charting connections, noting where allegiances might overlap or clash, where resentment could simmer beneath courteous interactions, and where minor slights could mask deadly intent. The social visitors were no less entangled in this web. Mrs. Aldridge's almost performative attention to detail could mask a desire for influence, or worse, a role in a subtle scheme. Friends of the family, who had appeared during earlier gatherings, might have been motivated by envy or revenge, their outward affability hiding darker inclinations. Each story she collected contained a sliver of truth, yet each also contained deliberate distortions, small enough to escape notice unless carefully examined. Sayers felt as if she were navigating a labyrinth of intentions, each turn revealing new questions without immediate answers. Sayers' eyes returned to the fragment of the telegram. The cryptic warning was more than a clue. It was a catalyst, a spark illuminating the web of motives she was beginning to untangle. Someone had orchestrated the events carefully, anticipating reactions, counting on assumptions and using the desires and fears of others as instruments of manipulation. The detective's mind worked tirelessly, connecting threads that on the surface seemed unrelated. Fear, greed, jealousy, and even affection twisted together, forming a dense network of possible motives. No single theory explained the crime, each suspect contained multiple potential reasons to act, and each action had consequences that affected others. Late in the evening, Sayers revisited the family's recent interactions with one another. Sir Reginald's cousin, who had been notably absent during initial interviews, suddenly came to mind. A man of ambitious temperament and a known quarrel over family inheritance. His absence during key moments raised questions about timing and opportunity. Was he simply away, or had he orchestrated events from a distance? Sayers made a mental note to investigate further. Similarly, the solicitor's subtle evasiveness and the housekeeper's concealed apprehension began to coalesce into a pattern. Each individual's motive intersected with others, forming a tangled lattice that resisted simple resolution. The detective paused, considering the next steps. The clues were no longer isolated, they were interconnected. To untangle the web, she would need to confront each suspect again. Not just to gather statements, but to observe reactions under pressure. Every hesitation, every misplaced glance, every defensive flourish might reveal the true alignment of intentions. The house itself had become a confounding map of human behavior. Each room holding fragments of truth and deception, each witness a vector pointing in multiple directions simultaneously. As she organized her notes for the night, Sayers felt the tension heighten, an almost physical weight pressing through the study. The labyrinth of motives had become apparent, yet the path to clarity remained hidden in subtle cues and layered interactions. She reflected on the cryptic telegram once more, the warning to observe beyond the obvious. It was no longer simply advice, it had become the guiding principle. To solve the case, she would have to navigate not only the physical spaces of the Harcourt estate, but also the intricacies of human desire and deceit. Passing intention from pretense, greed from fear, loyalty from manipulation. By the time the clock struck midnight, Sayers had constructed a tentative map of the house and its inhabitants, interweaving timelines with relationships, alibis with suspicions, and motives with opportunities. Each thread was a potential path toward the truth. Yet she knew the danger of assuming any one thread could fully explain the mystery. The tapestry was intricate, woven with precision, and the final image would not reveal itself without patience and careful attention. Somewhere within this maze of motives lay the key to Sir Reginald's fate. And Sayers felt a quiet certainty that the truth, once extracted, would expose a complexity that surpassed the mere surface of greed or jealousy. The morning sunlight crept cautiously through the heavy curtains of the Harcourt estate, illuminating the study where Sayers had spent the previous night untangling motives and timelines. The atmosphere, however, had shifted. News of a supposed breakthrough had reached the household, and the air was thick with relief and anticipation. Inspector Wallace, puffed with pride, announced that a pivotal discovery had been made: a set of fingerprints on the telegram, allegedly linking one of the household staff directly to the cryptic warning. The police had dubbed it the decisive clue, the key to unraveling the mystery that had so confounded them. Sayers listened quietly, letting the commotion unfold around her, while her sharp eyes continued to sweep the room. She noted the smiles, the whispered congratulations, and the subtle relief in some, the careful neutrality in others. The fingerprints, she considered, might have been planted or misinterpreted. The housekeeper, Mrs. Brindle, appeared unnaturally composed, and Hawthorne, the butler, seemed almost too eager to accept the conclusion. Her instincts, honed through years of discerning the smallest anomalies, whispered caution. Victory, if indeed this was victory, was far too tidy, too convenient, and the criminal mind rarely allowed such a simple resolution. Sayers requested a private examination of the telegram itself. Under her scrutiny, she noted details the authorities had missed: the slight smudge at the edge of the paper, the faint impression of another hand beneath the visible print. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but in that detail lay a contradiction. If the staff member identified by the police had truly handled the note, why would a second set of impressions exist in precisely the location they did? This discrepancy ignited a flicker of doubt within her. She recalled the initial warning embedded in the telegram, the implicit instruction to see beyond the obvious. What seemed conclusive might, in fact, be a deliberate distraction, a staged scene to mislead investigators and reassure the household that justice had been served. As the day progressed, Sayers conducted a series of quiet interviews, separate from the formal interrogations the police were conducting. She asked questions with a casual tone, observing reactions with meticulous attention. Mrs. Brindle's answers remained careful, precise, yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease whenever the telegram was mentioned. Hawthorne, the butler, repeated his statements without hesitation, almost mechanically, as though rehearsed in advance. Even the gardener, Penrose, seemed unusually relaxed, recounting his activities in the garden with a precision that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. These patterns of behavior, when considered together, suggested orchestration, a subtle performance intended to manipulate perception. Sayers turned her attention to the family itself. Lady Harcourt spoke freely of relief at the resolution, but her words felt rehearsed, her tone controlled. The cousin, whose absence had previously drawn her suspicion, appeared suddenly in the drawing room, casually remarking on the police's efficiency. His timing seemed too convenient. Was he genuinely returning to check on family matters, or had he been monitoring events from a distance, waiting for the right moment to intervene? The detective's instincts sharpened, while the authorities celebrated a superficial triumph. The true narrative of events remained hidden beneath layers of deception and self-interest. A subtle observation brought the first tangible sign of dissonance. While the police examined the staff member's supposed culpability, Sayers noted the placement of the telegram itself. Its original position on the desk had been slightly altered, the angle shifted as if someone had deliberately manipulated the scene. This small adjustment, almost imperceptible to anyone else, hinted at the hand of someone keenly aware of investigative methods. The criminal was not merely present. They were watching, orchestrating, ensuring that false leads would be accepted without challenge. That evening, Sayers asked to accompany the inspector on a review of the household. As they moved through rooms and corridors, she observed interactions closely, watching for tension or incongruities. The house had a strange stillness, punctuated by whispered conversations and careful glances. Mrs. Brindle and Hawthorne moved with an almost ritualistic caution, their paths calculated, their words deliberate. Penrose lingered longer than necessary near certain exits, and even Lady Harcourt seemed unnaturally composed, suggesting rehearsal rather than genuine relief. Each person's behavior added threads to a web that was far more intricate than the authorities understood. Then a small but telling detail caught her attention, a faint mark on the edge of the fireplace hearth. One that aligned perfectly with the missing telegram fragment from the previous night. The mark suggested that someone had handled the note in a manner inconsistent with the accepted narrative. Sayers' mind raced through possibilities. Could the criminal have planted the fingerprints to mislead the police? Had the telegram been intentionally repositioned to create a false sense of security? And most troubling of all, if this were the case, the perpetrator remained in the house, moving freely, confident that the investigation had reached a premature conclusion. Her instincts proved correct when a minor contradiction emerged in Hawthorne's account during casual questioning. He claimed to have been in the pantry, arranging supplies, at the very moment when the police suggested he had handled the telegram. The timing was impossible unless someone else had intervened, or he was lying to maintain a facade of innocence. Sayers noted the contradiction quietly, letting it simmer while outwardly expressing agreement with the authorities. Solution. Her mind worked like a loom, interweaving the discrepancy with prior observations, the altered position of the telegram, the dual impressions of fingerprints, the suspicious timing of arrivals and absences. Together, they painted a portrait of a clever mind, one that anticipated misdirection and exploited human trust. By late night, the household had settled into uneasy relief, but Sayers remained vigilant. She considered the psychology of the criminal someone with patience, intelligence, and a keen understanding of human behavior. The staged fingerprints, the subtle repositioning of evidence, the rehearsed responses, all suggested a methodical approach designed to manipulate perception and conceal the truth. The case was far from closed, in fact. This victory had only deepened the stakes, confirming that the perpetrator remained free, observing the investigators' every move and poised to strike again if necessary. Before retiring for the night, Sayers retraced her steps through the study, examining once more the desk, the papers, and the faint smudges that had eluded everyone else. Her fingers hovered over the telegram's corner, and she imagined the hand that had placed it so carefully, knowing it would be misinterpreted. The detective allowed herself a brief smile. This was the precise challenge she had anticipated. The criminal's confidence was evident, but so too was the vulnerability inherent in over-reliance on deception. One more layer of scrutiny, one more careful observation, and the shadow hiding the true culprit might be forced into the light. As midnight approached, Sayers made her plans for the following day. A careful orchestration of subtle questioning, observation of reactions, and verification of timelines. Each step would peel back a layer of the illusion, exposing the false victory for what it truly was. Somewhere in the Harcourt estate, the real criminal remained poised, waiting for missteps to capitalize on, but Sayers had begun to close the gap, aware that patience, attention to detail, and relentless focus would soon turn the shadows against the perpetrator. The game was far from over. In fact, it was entering its most dangerous, most revealing phase. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, the light filtering weakly through the heavy curtains, casting long, somber shadows across the Harcourt estate. Sayers had spent a restless night, turning over the pieces of the puzzle in her mind, aware that the false victory of the previous day was a trap in itself, a delicate veil concealing the true culprit. Her instincts urged her to probe deeper, to unearth the undercurrents of history that might be steering present events. She began her day in the library, a room thick with the dust of time and the weight of accumulated secrets. While the other household members moved about, content in the belief that the case had been solved, Sayers' eyes roamed over the shelves, scanning titles, old ledgers, and forgotten correspondence. One volume, a leather-bound collection of local court records, caught her attention, not for its contents at first, but for the way it had been displaced on the shelf, slightly askew, as if someone had recently consulted it in haste. Carefully, she retrieved it, flipping through pages until a case from 2 decades earlier drew her in, a scandal involving the previous generation of the Harcourt family, a dispute over inheritance that had ended in a quiet settlement, though rumors of deception lingered. Sayers' mind worked quickly, piecing together the echoes of the past with the events of the present. The names involved in the old case overlapped curiously with the current household. Lady Harcourt's late father had been implicated indirectly. The case had involved a close associate whose family still maintained ties to the estate. And Hawthorne, the butler, though only a young man at the time, had served in the same household, his loyalty to the family unquestioned then, and perhaps now tested by hidden resentments or unspoken debts. A pattern was emerging, one that tied the present crime to a chain of historical grievances, old alliances, and unresolved betrayals. Sayers requested to examine the correspondence and personal papers of the household, ostensibly under the guise of formal investigative procedure, but in truth to trace any residual threads from the past. Letters between Lady Harcourt and distant relatives revealed subtle references to financial disputes, veiled warnings, and careful instructions to protect certain secrets. One note in particular stood out. A brief mention of a telegram that must never see daylight, penned in Lady Harcourt's youthful hand. The words were cryptic but chilling in hindsight. Could the telegram that had sparked the current investigation be connected to this long, forgotten family feud? The detective felt a shiver of certainty. The past was not merely prologue, it had actively shaped the present, steering the hands of those involved. She turned her attention to Penrose, the gardener, who had been unusually composed in the previous interrogations. A careful question regarding his family connections revealed a subtle link. His father had been a clerk involved in the same old case, privy to confidential information and perhaps carrying the memory of injustices long buried. Penrose's calm demeanor, which once suggested indifference or rehearsed neutrality, now seemed infused with quiet calculation. He was not merely an observer, he had knowledge, context, and perhaps even a motive intertwined with grievances that predated the current generation. As the day progressed, Sayers traced other hidden connections. Mrs. Brindle, the housekeeper, had once served in another branch of the Harcourt family's estates, where she had been intimately involved with household financial management. Records hinted at disputes over allowances and inheritances, some of which had remained unresolved. Even small details, the care with which she had managed the current estate's accounts, her meticulous attention to minor discrepancies, now suggested that her knowledge of family finances and secrets could extend to manipulating the telegram's circumstances for personal advantage or protection of another party. The detective revisited the telegram itself, now armed with the context of history. She examined the paper, the faint smudges, and the dual impressions, this time considering not just the present household, but the legacy of those who had been intimately connected to past conflicts. The second, almost imperceptible impression, she realized, might have belonged to someone long gone, but whose methods and instructions had been preserved in notes, diaries, or oral directives now followed by the current generation. The crime, once thought to be isolated and contemporary, was layered with inherited knowledge, a blueprint of misdirection passed down through years of subtle influence. Sayers called Lady Harcourt for a quiet conversation, careful to avoid alarming the rest of the household. In her presence, the conversation was cordial, almost familial, yet probing. She asked about past disputes, minor disagreements, and any lingering resentments. Lady Harcourt, though careful, revealed more than she realized. A fleeting reference to a family servant from 2 decades prior, one who had vanished under curious circumstances, hinted at a history of concealment and strategic manipulation. Each revelation, minor in isolation, coalesced into a network of shadowed loyalties and buried secrets. By late afternoon, the detective gathered all observations, mapping them mentally into a web of cause and effect. The threads of the past wove directly into the present. Old grievances had shaped the behaviors of current suspects, knowledge from previous generations had guided manipulations, and the seemingly isolated act of sending a cryptic telegram was the culmination of years of subtle influence. Each suspect's motives now appeared not as isolated impulses, but as responses to inherited pressures, hidden debts, and historical loyalties. The crime, far from a spur-of-the-moment act, was rooted in a legacy of carefully cultivated deceptions. As evening settled over the estate, Sayers retreated briefly to the study, her mind racing with possibilities. She considered the interplay of time and motive, how the shadows of the past had masked the present, and how even minor details, letters, financial records, minor discrepancies in household routines, had provided the key to unlocking the deeper truth. The detective realized that the criminal was likely someone who understood this history intimately. Someone who could exploit it with precision, orchestrating a scenario that seemed modern yet was deeply entwined with generations of secrecy. Her next steps became clear. To expose the true culprit, she would need to confront the household with the revelations of history, drawing out reactions that betrayed knowledge only the perpetrator could possess. The investigation would no longer hinge solely on present-day evidence. It would require the careful unearthing of historical connections, the subtle testing of memory and loyalty, and the strategic observation of responses to suggestive questioning. The shadows of the past, long ignored, were now the key to illuminating the present. By nightfall, Sayers had devised a plan. She would leverage these historical connections to unsettle the household, to observe who responded with genuine surprise, who faltered under the weight of recognition, and who remained deceptively calm. The detective's mind was sharp, her senses attuned, and her resolve firm. The crime was no longer an isolated puzzle, it was a living, breathing network of intertwined motives, spanning generations. And the next stage of the investigation would demand all her skill to untangle the threads and reveal the face of the one who had carefully manipulated events from the shadows. Sayers rose early the next morning, her mind already alive with the threads of connection that had emerged from the past. While the household stirred with a quiet unease, she moved deliberately to the drawing room, carrying with her a seemingly innocuous object, a small, unassuming wax seal stamp, one that had belonged to Lady Harcourt's grandfather. Its presence, she knew, would trigger memories, associations, and perhaps the faintest hints of guilt among those who had preserved secrets across generations. Her plan was simple in execution, but subtle in effect. She arranged for the household to gather in the room under the pretense of examining additional estate documents, producing the seal as a point of discussion. "This belonged to the late Sir Edward," she said casually, turning it over in her hand. "A remarkable piece, not merely for its craftsmanship, but because of the impressions it leaves. You see, even the faintest indentation can reveal who has handled it." Her tone was light, almost offhand, but her eyes swept the room with calculated intensity, observing every micro-expression, every involuntary movement. At first, the group remained composed. Lady Harcourt smiled politely, Penrose nodded in acknowledgement, and Mrs. Brindle adjusted her apron as though nothing were unusual. Sayers allowed the silence to linger, letting tension accumulate naturally. "It occurs to me," she continued, "that items of this sort sometimes carry more than simple historical value. The past has a peculiar way of reaching into the present. Consider, for instance, the telegram we've been discussing, the subtle marks, the impressions, the small but revealing traces left behind. Often, people think these things are lost to time, yet they speak more clearly than words ever could." A slight flicker in Penrose's gaze caught her attention. So brief it might have been dismissed by a casual observer. His fingers twitched, almost imperceptibly, and his posture stiffened. Sayers allowed a gentle pause to follow, leaning forward slightly, as if inviting elaboration without pressing for it. Then, with deliberate calm, she said, "I imagine handling documents, letters, or telegrams that carry family weight is never easy. One can feel the responsibility, the potential consequences. It makes one consider whether the impressions left behind are intentional, or perhaps the product of worry, hesitation, or fear." The effect was immediate but subtle. Penrose's hand, which had rested calmly on the table, now flexed slightly, the knuckles whitening. He avoided Sayers' gaze for a moment, glancing instead toward the fireplace, as if anchoring himself to an immovable point. His reaction was minor, yet unmistakable, a crack in the carefully maintained mask. Others remained composed, but the detective knew the significance of even a small, unconscious signal. To build on this, Sayers shifted her approach. She brought out a sheet of paper and placed it on the table, drawing faint, uneven impressions with a pencil. Sometimes even the lightest pressure, she explained, can reveal more than what was intended. One need only apply a simple rubbing to uncover evidence, sometimes revealing the hand behind an action long assumed anonymous. She then instructed Lady Harcourt to observe the demonstration, highlighting the method without directly accusing anyone of wrongdoing. As the graphite revealed faint impressions of the previous handling, Sayers noted each glance, each subtle reaction, her attention honed to the minutest of cues. Penrose's unease deepened incrementally. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and began to stammer slightly when asked a clarifying question about the technique. The others offered questions in general curiosity, but his responses were cautious, measured, and yet tinged with hesitation. Sayers watched closely, cataloging these nuances. The detective did not need explicit confession, she only needed signs that contradicted what had been presented in earlier interviews, small fissures through which the truth might eventually surface. Next, she employed a psychological tactic that relied on indirect association. Sayers began speaking of loyalty, secrecy, and long-held obligations, weaving a narrative that suggested someone in the household had acted out of both fear and duty. "It is fascinating how devotion can take many forms," she remarked softly. "Some follow orders blindly, others weigh consequences carefully, and some, though outwardly compliant, cannot avoid leaving subtle traces of hesitation. One might think that loyalty is always visible, yet the cleverest acts often conceal themselves beneath the surface of ordinary behavior." The effect on Penrose was subtle but unmistakable. His hand began tapping nervously against the table, a rhythm he could not suppress, and his eyes flickered repeatedly toward the telegram still lying on a nearby side table. Mrs. Brindle noticed and frowned, but her reaction was guarded, protective of her own composure. Lady Harcourt, meanwhile, seemed to register only the general observation, nodding politely but giving no signal of deeper insight. Sayers allowed these responses to simmer, offering no immediate commentary, letting the psychological pressure work gradually. Then she posed a direct yet nuanced challenge. "One wonders," she said lightly, "how someone could be so certain of another's intentions, particularly when the past intertwines with the present. Could one truly act with full knowledge, or does the weight of inherited expectations shape every decision, no matter how deliberate it seems?" At this, Penrose's composure broke further. A fleeting glance toward Mrs. Brindle betrayed a silent communication, a recognition that the detective had pinpointed something he had hoped remained unnoticed. His lips parted, forming words he ultimately swallowed, and his hands began a subtle tremor. Sayers, watching all the while, recognized that she had reached the stage where pretense faltered, where instinct and memory collided, revealing a susceptibility to pressure that would eventually lead to truth. Sayers concluded the demonstration, retracting the wax seal and the impression sheet, but not the insight gained. She did not speak of guilt or accusation outright. Her role was to observe, to interpret, and to allow natural reactions to emerge under the veneer of casual curiosity. The detective now had a clear picture. Penrose's reaction confirmed a link between the current crime and the historical connections she had uncovered, the very family loyalties, fears, and inherited knowledge that had shaped his behavior. Later that evening, Sayers retreated to her study to compile the day's observations. She reviewed her notes carefully, comparing them with the past cases, the telegram, and the household interviews. Penrose's subtle breaks in composure, when considered alongside the inherited tensions and past grievances, formed a coherent thread. He had handled the telegram, or at least had intimate knowledge of it, and his actions were informed not merely by opportunity, but by a calculated awareness of its significance, honed through years of observing the family's hidden dynamics. Sayers' plan had succeeded the unconventional clue. The psychological test embedded in the display of the wax seal and the impressions had revealed a fissure in the web of deception, a crack too fine for ordinary procedures to detect, but unmistakable to a trained observer. The detective now had the leverage needed to deepen the investigation, to test further for inconsistencies, and to trace the sequence of manipulation from past to present with clarity. The stage was set to confront the underlying motives, exposing not just actions but the intentions shaped over decades that had culminated in the mysterious telegram and the unsolvable crime. By nightfall, Sayers felt a quiet surge of certainty. The unconventional approach had yielded more than a single reaction. It had illuminated the pathway to the truth, revealing the subtle ways in which fear, loyalty, and historical knowledge had intersected in the hands of someone skilled at concealment. The investigation was far from over, but the detective now held a decisive clue, one that would guide the next series of questions, the next careful observations, and ultimately, the unveiling of a carefully masked perpetrator lurking within the Harcourt household. The morning air in the Harcourt estate was thick with the residual tension of the previous day's revelations. Sayers arrived early, where her mind already circling the implications of Penrose's subtle cracks in composure. She had planned to review the telegram impressions once more, to cross-reference them with the family correspondence and household logs. But as she entered the study, she immediately sensed a disturbance. A faint chill, the kind that accompanied things out of place. The telegram lay on the desk, or at least its envelope did. The paper inside, the critical piece that had revealed the faint impressions, was gone. Sayers froze for a fraction of a second, then scanned the room systematically. Drawers had been opened, though neatly, and shelves slightly shifted, as if someone had moved through the room with quiet, practiced care. The absence of the document was no accident. The evidence, painstakingly gathered, had vanished. Her pulse quickened, but Sayers forced herself to remain calm. She closed the study door with a quiet click and retraced the previous evening's sequence in her mind. Only a few people had access, and fewer still could know the value of the impressions. Whoever had taken it was not merely acting out of curiosity. They intended to bury the truth, to delay the inevitable confrontation, perhaps even to manipulate the narrative before it could solidify. Sayers' first step was to secure the room and assess what remained. The wax seal, though innocuous, had not been disturbed, and the pencil rubbings were still intact. That, at least, suggested the thief had targeted the core piece deliberately, leaving a trail faint enough to escape casual notice, but discernible to a trained observer. She knelt to examine the floor and the edge of the desk, noting tiny scuffs in the polished wood, the faintest dust displacement, details that indicated a hurried lift, not a careful removal. She left a note for Lady Harcourt, requesting the immediate attendance of the household. Within minutes, the main suspects were assembled in the drawing room, each presenting a different shade of calm or surprise. Penrose's expression, however, betrayed the first hint of true unease. His eyes flickered toward the study door repeatedly, lips pressed thin, hands subtly fidgeting. Sayers allowed the silence to stretch, observing the unspoken exchanges among the group. "I noticed something curious," Sayers began, her tone measured. "Yesterday, we discussed the telegram and the impressions left upon it. I intended to review them again this morning, yet the document itself is absent. Disappeared. And naturally, when items vanish, one wonders about the circumstances, the timing, and the motive." She did not pause for answers, only watched. The room reacted in subtle waves. Lady Harcourt adjusted her shawl, a nervous tic she rarely displayed. Mrs. Brindle's hands clenched in the folds of her apron, but she maintained a veneer of composed propriety. Penrose, however, could not restrain the slight tremor in his fingers, nor the way his gaze darted to the floor. Sayers leaned forward, emphasizing casual interest rather than accusation. "Of course, we must consider all possibilities. Perhaps it was misplaced. Perhaps some external factor caused it to be removed. Yet one cannot ignore the implications. Evidence does not vanish without purpose, particularly in a case where timing is crucial and the stakes are high." Penrose's response was a micro-expression, a flicker of panic that betrayed far more than words could. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, and for a brief moment, his composure crumbled entirely before he recovered with a forced calm. The detective noted this, understanding that the act of taking or knowing about the disappearance required a knowledge that only a few could possess. Sayers took another step, subtly shifting the focus from the missing paper to the patterns of behavior surrounding it. When evidence disappears, it is often because someone fears the consequences of its revelation. The impression left by a document, the trace it carries, is often more powerful than a written confession. One might remove it to prevent scrutiny or to buy time. But time, as always, has a way of revealing even carefully concealed acts. Her words were a trap, indirect yet incisive, designed to provoke an involuntary reaction. Penrose shifted again, this time more noticeably, his hand brushing against the edge of the table as if seeking contact with a reassuring surface. Mrs. Brindle's eyes flicked toward him briefly, almost imperceptibly, as if recognizing a shared awareness that was otherwise unspoken. Lady Harcourt, still poised, gave a polite nod, but her eyes held a question, a curiosity tinged with concern. Sayers then proceeded to the practical measures. She examined the room meticulously, retracing the route from the desk to the door, noting a faint smudge on the handle, subtle fingerprints on the woodwork, but a minor indentation on the rug, where someone had apparently knelt. Each clue was fragmentary, but together they formed a faint map of movement, an invisible trail leading to the identity of the individual responsible. "I find it fascinating," Sayers said lightly. "How people think they can erase their involvement simply by removing an object. Yet the manner of removal, the choice of timing, and the interactions with others often leave a footprint larger than the item itself." She allowed the statement to hang, a gentle but persistent pressure. Penrose could not meet her gaze. He glanced at Mrs. Brindle, then at Lady Harcourt, before shifting uneasily. The detective observed everything, the subtle avoidance, the brief hesitation before answering even neutral questions, the slight inconsistencies in posture and expression. These were the signals that mattered, more than the absence of the telegram itself. Sayers understood that the vanishing evidence was more than a setback. It was confirmation that the case had touched nerves too sensitive to allow impartial examination. Someone was actively working against the investigation, and the motive was personal, precise, and urgent. By removing the telegram, They had not only delayed discovery, but also revealed themselves as a calculated presence within the household, capable of acting swiftly and discreetly. The detective then turned her attention to the relationships among the suspects. The disappearance had implications beyond mere obstruction. It suggested alliances, unspoken agreements, and perhaps a chain of influence reaching from Penrose to others whose composure remained intact, but whose vigilance had faltered. Sayers began to map these connections in her mind, layering behavioral observations onto the known history of the household, tracing who had access, who had knowledge, and who could act with intention under the guise of normalcy. By late afternoon, Sayers had begun to reconstruct the sequence of the theft, hypothesizing methods, motives, and potential concealment strategies. The vanishing evidence had raised the stakes immeasurably. Trust within the household had become fragile, suspicion layered upon suspicion. Every gesture, every hesitation, every glance could be a clue. And the detective knew she must proceed with caution, probing further yet leaving no hint of overt pressure that might drive the guilty party to more desperate measures. As twilight fell, Sayers allowed herself a moment of reflection. The missing telegram was no mere obstacle. It was a signal, a deliberate interference with her investigation, a move by someone determined to manipulate the path to truth. Yet, paradoxically, this act of obstruction had illuminated as much as it had hidden. The reactions, the micro-expressions, the inconsistencies, these were the threads she would follow, more telling than the physical evidence itself. In seeking to bury the truth, the perpetrator had unwittingly revealed the outlines of their own presence. The detective now had a clear path forward. She would need to employ further psychological tactics, observe behavioral patterns with even greater scrutiny, and anticipate attempts to obscure reality. The case was no longer merely a puzzle of past connections and subtle impressions. It had become a delicate dance of concealment and revelation, where each step, each choice, carried enormous weight. The vanishing evidence had elevated the game, and Sayers, poised and watchful, was ready to meet it. The night descended over the Harcourt estate like a suffocating velvet curtain, each shadow seeming to stretch longer than the last. Sayers lingered in the study, mentally cataloguing the subtle shifts in behavior she had observed since the disappearance of the telegram. Every nuance, every fleeting expression formed a mosaic she had yet to fully decipher. Her musings were abruptly interrupted by the urgent clatter of footsteps on the stone terrace outside. She moved quickly to the window, drawing back the heavy curtains to glimpse the source. A figure stumbled across the moonlit courtyard, Mr. Penrose. His usual composure was entirely absent, replaced by the raw, uncontrolled panic of someone who had witnessed or committed something unthinkable. Sayers did not hesitate. She grabbed her coat and raced down the staircase, each step measured and precise, her mind already passing possibilities. As she emerged onto the terrace, Penrose collapsed against the wrought iron railing, gasping for breath, eyes wide with terror. It's happened again," he stammered, voice cracking under the weight of fear. In the East Wing, it's terrible. I don't understand." Sayers' instincts flared. The East Wing had been largely quiet for months, its rooms seldom used except for storage and occasional guest accommodations. She motioned for Penrose to step aside, carefully scanning the dim corridors as they approached. There, at the threshold of a long, shadowed hallway, lay the body of Mrs. Brindle. She had been discovered by one of the night staff, who had summoned Penrose in panic. Her expression was frozen in shock, the scene horrifying yet meticulous. No struggle, no sign of forced entry, only the eerie precision of a calculated act. Sayers knelt beside the body, her keen eyes tracing every detail. The positioning of the arms, the slight tilt of the head, and the almost ritualistic arrangement of a single, folded note clutched in her hand, all pointed toward the hand of someone who wanted the act to convey a message. She unfolded the paper carefully, reading the brief but chilling words. "You are slower than I expected. Catch me if you can." Her mind raced. The vanishing telegram, the subtle cracks in Penrose's behavior, and now a second victim, all suggested a mind several steps ahead, anticipating moves, exploiting weaknesses. Whoever was behind this was not merely reactive. They were orchestrating the events, manipulating the household, and using fear as a tool to control the investigation. Penrose remained rooted to the spot, wringing his hands, muttering fragments of concern and confusion. Sayers' attention, however, was elsewhere. She examined the hallway, noting the faint traces of mud on the carpet, the subtle indentation of shoes not matching any of the regular staff. The perpetrator had passed through swiftly, leaving only the barest hints of their presence, enough for a keen observer to follow if they knew what to look for. The unexpected twist of a second murder altered the stakes entirely. No longer was this a case of uncovering a long, buried secret or piecing together a missing telegram. It had become a matter of immediate danger. The killer was still active, still observing, and, most alarmingly, still capable of striking at will. The pattern Sayers had been tracing with care was now disrupted, replaced with a new urgency. She had to anticipate the next move before another life was claimed. Returning briefly to Penrose, Sayers noted his distraction. The subtle avoidance of eye contact, the restless pacing. He was terrified, yes, but her instincts warned her that fear alone did not explain every nuance. Had he seen the killer, or was he implicated in some indirect way? She filed the possibility for later consideration, unwilling to let assumptions cloud immediate action. Sayers then gathered the household in the main drawing room once more. Lady Harcourt's composure was fraying. Though she tried to maintain her elegance, servants whispered behind hands, casting furtive glances at one another. "This changes everything," Sayers said evenly, her gaze sweeping the room. "The situation is no longer about the past or minor deception. We are dealing with an active, dangerous individual who is aware of our movements and capabilities. Every action we take must be deliberate, every observation precise." Questions erupted, voices overlapping, each person projecting their anxieties and suspicions outward. Yet Sayers remained focused. She began organizing the household logically, dividing duties, establishing observation posts, and requesting full logs of comings and goings. She did not reveal her private suspicions. Those she would confirm through discreet investigation and subtle manipulation. The detective also examined the note clutched in Mrs. Brindle's hand for any hidden signs. Watermarks, fingerprints, traces of ink indicative of origin. She considered the possibility of misdirection. The note could have been deliberately left for psychological impact, designed to divert attention from the true method or motive of the killer. In the previous murder, the vanished telegram had misled authorities and created a false sense of progress. Now, the note had escalated fear, and Sayers knew that fear was exactly what the perpetrator intended. Night deepened, and the household settled into a tense vigilance. Sayers walked the corridors herself, retracing the potential path of the killer, checking exits, examining windows, and noting points of vulnerability. Each detail added a layer of understanding. The perpetrator had intimate knowledge of the estate, familiarity with its habits, and the ability to exploit subtle weaknesses without raising immediate suspicion. Her thoughts returned to the interactions of the day. The subtle expressions, the fleeting gestures, the hesitations that had seemed minor before. One thing was now certain: the killer was not merely opportunistic but strategic, playing a larger game that involved psychological manipulation as much as physical action. Every movement, every disclosure was part of a controlled narrative, and Sayers understood that the next phase would require not just observation, but anticipation, a predictive reading of human behavior under duress. By the early hours, Sayers had begun to reconstruct probable scenarios, mapping motives, opportunities, and behavioral patterns. She noted inconsistencies in alibis, minor contradictions in statements, and the faintest hints of panic in those previously considered composed. The killer's audacity, striking a second time so soon, suggested confidence, precision, and perhaps an underestimation of her own methodical approach. As dawn broke, Sayers convened a quiet meeting with Penrose and Lady Harcourt, emphasizing calm and careful strategy. She outlined the immediate precautions, the importance of documenting every interaction, and the need to remain observant without succumbing to fear. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, she felt the heightened pulse of urgency. The killer was out there, aware, calculating, and waiting for the right moment to exploit any misstep. The unexpected twist had transformed the investigation from a search for truth into a race against time. Sayers knew that each subsequent action could provoke another move from the perpetrator, and every decision carried weight. With the estate now shadowed by danger, the detective resolved to anticipate the unseen, to read the subtle signs that others overlooked, and to remain several steps ahead in a deadly game where the next turn might be the most decisive of all. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the heavy curtains of the Harcourt estate, casting a muted glow over the drawing room where Sayers had spent the early hours reviewing notes, statements, and observations. The house felt smaller, more claustrophobic after the second murder. Every hallway, every doorway seemed a potential hiding place, every shadow a possible witness or accomplice. Sayers paced slowly, her mind methodically sifting through the fragments of the case, each minor detail demanding scrutiny. It was Penrose who inadvertently provided the breakthrough. He had been recounting the previous day's events, his words tumbling out in anxious fragments, when Sayers noticed a peculiar repetition. I saw her heading toward the east wing, yes, but she paused, she lingered near the tapestry, he said, the words stumbling out like reluctant confessions. The mention of the tapestry had seemed inconsequential before, buried beneath the urgency and fear of the moment, but now it rang with significance. Sayers' mind zeroed in, the tapestry. A large, ornate piece depicting a hunting scene, its colors faded with age. It hung slightly off, center on the wall of the east wing corridor. To most, it was merely decorative, a relic of an earlier era, but Sayers had noted subtle anomalies there before. An indentation in the floor, a faint discoloration along the edge, a slight bulge behind the fabric. Nothing had made sense until now. She approached the tapestry, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric. Beneath it, hidden from casual view, was a small panel set flush with the wall. A concealed compartment. Carefully, she pressed the latch, and it clicked open to reveal a stack of letters, their edges yellowed, corners frayed. The handwriting was familiar. It belonged to someone who had appeared innocuous throughout the investigation, someone whose motives had seemed benign, even trivial. Sayers' eyes scanned the letters rapidly, absorbing names, dates, and cryptic references. What had seemed like disjointed observations, an odd habit of tidying papers in a specific sequence, the insistence on checking certain rooms repeatedly, the way conversations were steered away from particular subjects, now converged into a clear pattern. The perpetrator had been signaling, manipulating events, and leaving markers all along, confident that no one would notice their significance. A sudden memory surfaced, the first telegram that had gone missing, and the subtle way Penrose had flinched when its disappearance was mentioned. He had believed it trivial, yet it had been carefully removed to prevent an early link from being made. The second murder, the note left with Mrs. Brindle. The timing of the disturbances in the East Wing. All had been choreographed to draw attention away from the underlying scheme. The pattern was not chaotic. It was deliberate, controlled, and almost obsessively precise. Sayers carefully laid out the letters on a nearby table, grouping them by sender and recipient. She traced connections, charting motives, interactions, and opportunities. Each piece now fell into a larger framework, a network of relationships built on old grievances, secret alliances, and long, festering resentments. The web extended beyond the household, reaching into business dealings, past disputes, and unspoken betrayals. The tapestry, a symbol of heritage and status, had concealed not just letters, but the linchpin of the entire sequence of crimes. She paused, letting the realization settle. For weeks, she had been chasing shadows, distracted by misleading clues, vanishing telegrams, and staged incidents. But the key had been in plain sight all along, the subtle insistence on order. The repeated glances toward the tapestry, the faint but consistent marks of movement around its edges. The perpetrator had relied on assumptions. Assumptions about inattention, about fear, about distraction. Sayers had learned to question every assumption, to weigh every detail, and it had led her here. Her mind shifted to the household itself. Each suspect's behavior now fell into sharper relief. Why minor contradictions in statements, offhand comments about seemingly trivial matters and unusual habits, collecting small objects, checking doors repeatedly, lingering in certain rooms, revealed themselves as deliberate misdirections or signals. The pattern connected them in ways that had eluded others. The timing of interactions, the choice of locations, even the selection of victims. It was a network of psychological manipulation, an invisible choreography that only a patient, observant mind could discern. Sayers reviewed the letters once more, noting repeated references to debts, favors, and subtle threats that had been invisible without context. The seemingly unrelated incidents, the missing telegram, the misfiled documents, the surveillance of servants, were all threads in a tapestry of influence and intimidation. The perpetrator had created a system, an almost mechanical precision in execution, ensuring that every event fed into the next, every reaction anticipated. She realized that the East Wing, long considered peripheral, was in fact central to the crimes. The positioning of the tapestry was no accident, it marked a focal point, a place where the perpetrator could observe movements, manage communications, and manipulate perceptions. Every person who had passed that corridor, every glance and gesture had been carefully monitored. The letters confirmed what had been suspected. The crimes were as much about control and fear as about the act itself. Penrose returned, drawn by the urgency in Sayers' demeanor. She briefed him quietly, pointing to the letters, explaining the significance of the East Wing, and outlining the emerging pattern. His face went pale as the connections crystallized before him. "All this time, I didn't see it," he whispered, the weight of complicity and ignorance pressing down. "And we thought it was random, a chaos we couldn't comprehend." "No," Sayers said softly, her tone calm but resolute. "It was never random. It was designed to seem so, but every act, every omission, every subtle detail has been a piece of a larger scheme. Now that we see the pattern, we can anticipate the next move. We can understand the logic behind the fear and the manipulation. That gives us an advantage, but only if we act carefully. Her mind returned to the immediate task of securing the household, ensuring that no further tampering could occur, and planning a methodical approach to confront the perpetrator. The pattern revealed not just the who, but the how and why, the guiding principles behind the crimes. This understanding was crucial. It transformed the investigation from reactive pursuit to strategic anticipation. Sayers spent the next hours reconstructing a timeline of movements, interactions, and manipulations, aligning them with the details gleaned from the letters. Minor inconsistencies in alibis now became glaring in light of the pattern. Behavioral cues previously dismissed as nervousness or distraction revealed calculated acts of concealment or diversion. The perpetrator's confidence, built on the assumed invisibility of these small details, was now vulnerable to scrutiny. By late afternoon, Sayers had charted a comprehensive map of the interactions, locations, and timing of events. The seemingly chaotic series of murders, vanishing evidence, and cryptic notes now formed a coherent structure, a pattern that could be leveraged to predict the perpetrator's next move. She sensed, with the familiar thrill of discovery, that the case was entering its final, decisive phase. The web was unraveling, the threads exposed, and soon the individual who had orchestrated this complex series of crimes would find themselves confronting the meticulous logic of a mind that refused to overlook even the smallest clue. The revelation of the pattern left Sayers both exhilarated and cautious. Every movement, every word, every minor adjustment within the Harcourt estate now made sense, but clarity alone was not enough. Understanding the perpetrator's methodology did not yet explain the driving force behind it. And it was the motive, the hidden, nearly invisible spark, that would ultimately determine how the case concluded. Sayers returned to the letters, reading them with renewed attention. The content, at first glance mundane, business arrangements, social obligations, occasional threats, had masked subtle emotional undertones. She noted repeated references to slights that had occurred decades ago, passing comments that had been dismissed as trivial or forgotten, and persistent allusions to honor, reputation, and personal humiliation. It was not wealth or power that had driven the crimes, nor simple revenge against a single individual. The crimes were an elaborate, meticulous expression of an internal narrative, a deeply personal story that the villain had been compelled to act out, meticulously, over time. As she pieced together the chronology, a disturbing picture emerged. The first victim had been targeted not for what they had done, but for what they represented, a reminder of a past humiliation the perpetrator could not forgive. The second murder, staged to appear connected, was in fact a message, a demonstration of the consequences of ignoring this hidden grievance. Even the stolen and destroyed evidence had served a psychological purpose: to create panic, to distract, and to establish dominance. The pattern was no longer just a tactical puzzle, it was a window into the perpetrator's psyche. Sayers looked up from the letters, her eyes scanning the east wing once more. Every detail she had observed, the obsessive tidiness, the careful timing, the manipulation of perception, now revealed its psychological function. The perpetrator had been orchestrating events not only to eliminate obstacles, but to assert control over the narrative of their own life, reshaping history in their favor. It was a motive rooted in identity, in self-perception, in the desperate need to rewrite humiliation as power. The breakthrough came when Sayers noticed a repeated theme in the correspondence, the reference to an old, long, forgotten legal dispute involving the estate. Most had considered it resolved decades ago, a minor scandal buried under paperwork and time. But the letters indicated that for the perpetrator, It had never been forgotten. Every insult, every slight, every perceived betrayal had been catalogued and stored, growing in intensity over the years. This was not simply revenge. It was a compulsion to reclaim a narrative, to assert control over a past that had been denied them. Sayers' mind raced through the implications. If the motive was psychological in nature, then the perpetrator's behavior would be predictable in its irrational logic. The seemingly random acts of intimidation, the timing of murders, the targeted threats, they were all expressions of this obsessive need to restore perceived balance. Each move had been calculated to demonstrate power over those who had wronged them, real or imagined, and to manipulate everyone around them into acknowledging that dominance, whether consciously or unconsciously. The detective decided to confront the suspects once more, armed not only with the pattern she had identified, but with an understanding of the underlying motive. She gathered Penrose and the household staff in the drawing room, presenting the scenario with care, noting behaviors and responses, and observing subtle shifts in posture, eye movement, and tone. The villain had always relied on assumptions about fear, distraction, and disbelief. But now Sayers could apply psychological pressure in a precise, controlled manner. It was during a casual remark, almost as an afterthought, that the crucial reaction occurred. Sayers mentioned the old legal dispute, framing it as a minor historical curiosity. The reaction was instantaneous. A flicker of tension, a tightening of the hands, a small, almost imperceptible tremor. The perpetrator, believing the past irrelevant to current scrutiny, had not anticipated it would resurface. That small reaction betrayed a deeply personal connection, an emotional vulnerability that had been carefully hidden. Sayers pressed gently, weaving questions that seemed innocuous but were designed to probe the emotional resonance of the past grievance. The answers came haltingly at first, laced with deflection and false bravado, but gradually revealed fragments of a deeper story. The villain's identity coalesced not around opportunity or circumstance, but around obsession, humiliation, and the unyielding need to assert control over perceived wrongs. The motivation was no longer abstract. It was intimate, almost pathological, and terrifyingly rational in its own logic. Each behavioral anomaly that had puzzled Sayers before now made perfect sense. The stolen evidence had been about maintaining the illusion of control. The offhand comments, the orchestrated misdirections, the careful observation of others, all were symptoms of a psyche driven by the compulsion to rewrite the narrative of personal failure into one of dominance. The perpetrator's meticulous planning, once seen as clever strategy, was now understood as a psychological imperative. Each act a necessary component of an internal logic the rest of the world struggled to comprehend. Sayers realized that the case's danger lay not in the obvious, external threats, but in the internal consistency of the perpetrator's motives. Every move was not only deliberate, but emotionally imperative. The villain would not stop until their narrative was complete, until they had transformed perceived injustice into absolute control, until they had manipulated reality to match the story they had constructed over decades. Understanding this meant anticipating not merely what they might do next, but why, and how every action would satisfy the psychological compulsions driving them. The detective worked late into the evening, compiling notes and aligning behaviors with the emerging psychological profile. The seemingly erratic sequence of events now resembled a map of obsession, each waypoint a manifestation of a personal grievance. Sayers understood that the confrontation would require more than deduction. It would require an understanding of the villain's emotional and mental framework, a careful navigation of pride, fear, and obsession. By nightfall, She had outlined a strategy that combined timing, observation, and psychological leverage. The perpetrator could no longer hide in the shadows of circumstance or assumption. The hidden motive had been revealed, and with it, the path to resolution became clear. Sayers knew that the coming confrontation would test her ability to manipulate perception, anticipate reaction, and confront a mind driven by personal obsession rather than mere greed or malice. The complexity of motive had elevated the stakes, making the case both more dangerous and more compelling. As the house settled into silence, Sayers allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The crime had been intricate, but the true challenge had never been about the mechanics alone. It had been about the human mind, its capacity for obsession, for reinterpretation of past wrongs, for constructing elaborate systems of manipulation in the service of a personal narrative. And now that the underlying motive was revealed, the detective could see the final pieces of the puzzle coming into focus, leading inevitably to the confrontation that would determine the outcome of the case. Sayers stood in the dimly lit drawing room, the heavy curtains drawn against the night, casting elongated shadows that seemed to tremble with anticipation. The house was silent, save for the distant ticking of the grandfather clock, each measured beat a reminder that the moment she had been preparing for had arrived. She had orchestrated every detail, predicted every possible reaction, and now, finally, it was time to confront the mind that had upended so many lives with its hidden obsessions. Penrose had been summoned under the pretense of reviewing the remaining estate papers, unaware that the room had been subtly arranged to serve as a psychological stage. Every chair, every placement of objects, every subtle line of sight had been considered. Sayers knew the villain's compulsions well enough to exploit them, the obsession with control, the need for acknowledgement, the unyielding desire to manipulate perception. The trap was not physical, it was mental. A confrontation that would leave no room for deception. When Penrose entered, the gentleman's usual composure seemed brittle, a thin veneer over tension that he did not fully disguise. His eyes flicked to the desk, then to the carefully arranged papers, as though sensing the invisible snare laid before him. Sayers observed silently, noting the slight quiver in his fingers, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. The smallest details now spoke volumes, revealing the cracks in the carefully constructed facade. "I trust you've reviewed the documents I asked you to examine," Sayers began, her tone calm yet pointed, carrying just enough weight to unsettle. Penrose nodded stiffly, avoiding her gaze. Sayers allowed a moment to stretch, giving the impression of casual conversation while noting every micro-expression, every slight hesitation. "It seems," she continued, letting her voice soften into almost idle musing, "that some things from the past cannot stay buried. Curiously, certain old disputes resurface in ways one might not expect." She placed a letter on the desk with deliberate care, its contents visible but not immediately readable. Some correspondences, once overlooked, can reveal more than their authors ever intended. Penrose's hand twitched toward the paper, then withdrew, his composure fracturing just enough for Sayers to see the first real sign of fear. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control, but the subtle tension in his posture betrayed him. Sayers pressed forward, maintaining a steady, unhurried cadence. "You see," she said softly, "there is a pattern here. A pattern that connects events thought separate, motives believed hidden, and actions dismissed as coincidence. But the truth has a way of asserting itself, no matter how carefully one tries to suppress it." Her eyes held his unwavering, as if inviting confession, daring deception. The first crack appeared not in words, but in a fleeting glance, a dart of acknowledgement that Sayers instantly recognized. Penrose had not expected the past to be weaponized in this way, and the psychological weight of the pattern was beginning to press against him. Sayers leaned slightly forward, letting silence hang, giving the tension room to breathe. The human mind, when cornered, often reveals its secrets in the smallest gestures. Finally, Penrose spoke, his voice low, controlled yet tinged with desperation. "I don't understand what you mean." Sayers allowed a faint smile, almost imperceptible, to touch her lips. "You will. Every subtle act, every misplaced item, every careful misdirection. It all points to a single source. Not opportunity, not circumstance, but intent. You intended to shape the world, to reflect a narrative only you could see. And now that narrative is unraveling." The calm precision of her words seemed to unmoor him further. Penrose's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, a physical manifestation of the inner conflict roiling beneath the surface. Sayers continued, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering. "You believed no one would notice, that the shadows of the past would remain hidden. Yet here we are, and the truth is plain. Your obsession has left a trail, one that cannot be erased." Penrose's composure broke, just as Sayers had anticipated. A tremor ran through his body, his face pale, and for a moment, he looked like a man confronting not Sayers, but the consequences of his own compulsions. He tried to speak, to deflect, but his words faltered. Sayers pressed gently, not with accusation, but with logic, letting the weight of undeniable fact bear down upon him. "You think your actions were clever," she said, "that each step was a secret, each manipulation unseen. But the smallest details, the tiniest inconsistencies, betray even the most meticulous planning. The pattern has emerged, and now there is nowhere left to hide." For a long moment, there was silence. Penrose's gaze darted to the letter again, then to the objects on the desk, as if searching for some escape route that did not exist. The tension was almost unbearable, the room charged with anticipation. Then, in a sudden, desperate movement, he lunged toward the window, intending to flee. Sayers was ready. Calmly, without haste, she stepped forward, intercepting him with a firm grip, her presence both commanding and unyielding. "Stop," she said, voice calm but firm. Penrose froze, the fight in him halted by the simple, undeniable assertion of control. He turned slowly, eyes wide, as the futility of resistance became clear. Sayers' grip did not falter, her observation unbroken, her strategy exact. In the moments that followed, Penrose's resistance melted into reluctant acknowledgement. He sank into a chair, head in his hands, and the confession came, halting at first, then with a mounting force as the psychological pressure of exposure overcame him. He spoke of old humiliations, of perceived betrayals, of the compulsion to manipulate and control, each word a thread unraveling the elaborate tapestry of deceit he had woven. Sayers listened, noting each nuance, each subtle admission that confirmed the motives she had painstakingly uncovered. By the time Penrose's account concluded, the house felt heavy with the gravity of truth. Sayers knew that the danger had not vanished entirely. The mind she had confronted was cunning, but capable of resistance. But the confrontation had succeeded in one crucial respect: the hidden motive had been fully exposed, and the villain was now in her grasp. The detective allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, the satisfaction tempered by vigilance. The case had demanded intellect, observation, and understanding of human psychology, and in that convergence, the trap had worked perfectly. The final confrontation had been won not through force, but through patience, precision, and the careful unraveling of obsession. The villain's confessions now formed the foundation for the resolution to come, and Sayers could see, with unerring clarity, how justice would be served. As the night deepened, the shadows in the room no longer held menace but resolution. The intricate web of deceit, manipulation, and obsession had been untangled, and the truth, long obscured by years of hidden motives and careful calculation, stood revealed. Sayers had navigated the maze of human complexity, anticipated every move, and, in the end, confronted the darkness with steady hands and unshakable mind. The case was far from over. The legal and social consequences still lay ahead. But the pivotal moment had passed. The final confrontation had achieved its purpose. The mind behind the crimes was revealed, the motive laid bare, and the path to justice illuminated with a clarity that no further deception could obscure. Even as the morning light filtered through the heavy drapes, casting long slats of gold across the drawing room, Sayers could feel the case still thrumming with unresolved tension. Penrose had been secured, his confession thorough, his motives laid bare, yet something in the back of her mind whispered caution. The puzzle felt complete, and yet the edges of the picture refused to settle. There was a residue, subtle but unmistakable, that hinted at a truth not yet uncovered. She returned to the scattered papers, the letters, and the meticulously kept ledgers she had reviewed countless times. Each document had been scrutinized in the previous confrontation, but Sayers approached them again with a fresh lens, seeking what she now realized she had overlooked in the fever of unraveling Penrose's obsession. As her eyes moved over a ledger detailing minor financial exchanges, one line caught her attention. Not remarkable at first glance, a simple deposit made by an anonymous source. But the date, the subtle irregularity in the handwriting, and the pattern of withdrawals aligned perfectly with events preceding the crimes. Her pulse quickened. This was not Penrose's doing. The meticulous criminal mind she had faced had acted out of personal compulsion, but this was someone else entirely, someone with foresight, patience, and the ability to manipulate not just people, but the very investigation itself. Sayers realized the case was not yet closed. The confession had been genuine. Yes, but it had been carefully guided, orchestrated to mask the hand of another, deeper intelligence. A soft knock on the door drew her attention. It was Inspector Vane, sent by the local authorities to ensure Penrose's detention and to gather Sayers' final observations. He looked wary, but there was an edge of unease in his expression as he stepped inside. "Everything resolved?" he asked cautiously, glancing at the papers laid out on the desk. "Almost," Sayers replied, her voice measured, but tinged with urgency. "Penrose has confessed, and his motives are clear. But I believe we have overlooked another factor, a hidden influence shaping events behind the scenes." Vane's brow furrowed. "You think there's someone else?" "Yes," she said, rising to examine a small, nearly imperceptible mark on the corner of one ledger page. "Penrose is meticulous, but he is not omniscient. Whoever this is has been manipulating him, subtly steering his actions, and ensuring that certain outcomes occurred while remaining invisible." Vane moved closer, curiosity piqued. "But how do we prove it?" Sayers allowed herself a small smile, one that carried the weight of intellectual challenge. "We watch for the inconsistencies, the subtle contradictions in his story, the places where he over-explains or hesitates. The mind behind this will reveal itself in what they cannot entirely control." She set Penrose's confession aside and began piecing together the minor, almost trivial events: notes misplaced and retrieved, phone calls ignored or intercepted, appointments mysteriously rescheduled. Each anomaly had seemed inconsequential in isolation, but together they wove a tapestry pointing not to Penrose alone, but to someone orchestrating the stage from the shadows. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp, insistent ring from her private line. Picking up. She found herself listening to a distorted voice, one that seemed to come from no fixed location. The message was brief, chillingly precise. "You've gone too far, Sayers. Some truths are meant to stay buried." The line went dead before she could respond. Sayers' mind raced. The voice was unfamiliar, but the timing was impeccable. This was no random intimidation. Someone was aware not only of her progress, but also of her methods. And now they were stepping into the light, revealing their presence for the first time. The realization struck her with both dread and fascination. The real mastermind was not the man before her in confession, but a figure who had been manipulating the investigation at every turn. She immediately considered her options, weighing them with characteristic precision. The first step was to test the reaction of those who might have had access to Penrose's activities, to observe who displayed subtle signs of nervousness or avoidance. Sayers also had to remain cautious. Any overt action could alert the puppet master, forcing them further into concealment or prompting rash retaliation. She returned to Penrose, seated now in the interrogation room, his demeanor more subdued but still tinged with defiance. "There is someone else," she stated quietly, ensuring that Vane did not overhear. Penrose's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and confusion flashing across his features. "Someone who guided you." He hesitated, and Sayers seized the moment, leaning forward. "Think carefully. Every step you took, every move, someone else knew about it. Someone who wanted the final outcome without exposing themselves. Can you name them?" Penrose swallowed hard, the first true moment of vulnerability in weeks. He shook his head. "I don't know. I thought I was acting alone. It was all me." Sayers' lips pressed into a thin line. His insistence on solitary guilt was expected. A true manipulator would have left him unknowing, convinced of his autonomy, while they worked behind the curtain. Yet the inconsistencies she had observed, the subtle nudges in behavior, the perfectly timed misdirections, could not be ignored. The game was far from over. The next hours were a careful ballot of observation and deduction. Sayers revisited the crime scenes, not for physical evidence, which had been largely exhausted, but for patterns of human behavior. She cross-referenced timelines, re-interviewed witnesses, and monitored Penrose's communications, all while Vane followed her lead with cautious respect. It was during a quiet examination of the third crime scene, a room meticulously cleaned but still retaining faint traces of previous presence, that she noticed it a symbol, barely visible on the edge of a window frame, distinct from any mark Penrose had been capable of leaving. It was an insignia of some sort, a personal flourish, deliberate, but subtle enough that only a keen eye would catch it. Sayers' pulse quickened. The mark suggested the identity of someone intimately familiar with the crime scenes and with the psychological manipulation of Penrose. The final twist, she realized, was at hand. The person behind the crimes had been walking alongside them all along, hidden in plain sight, and had left a signature that only now revealed itself. By the evening, Sayers had formulated a plan. She would stage a controlled reveal, drawing out the true mastermind by implying a final, irreversible conclusion to the case. She arranged the same drawing room where Penrose had confessed, this time placing the symbol in full view, ensuring that the hidden player would recognize it immediately. Every detail had to be perfect. The lighting, the positioning, even the cadence of conversation. Hours later, as predicted, the door creaked, and an unexpected visitor entered. Not a shadow from the criminal underworld, nor an obvious accomplice, but someone entirely familiar to Sayers, an associate whose reputation for reliability and discretion had obscured a far darker cunning. Their eyes fell on the symbol, and in that instant, a flicker of recognition betrayed them. Sayers observed quietly, allowing the tension to mount. The trap now fully set. The final confrontation was not yet verbal, but it had begun. The last-minute twist had emerged, shaking the case to its core. Sayers knew that the true test of her genius was imminent, to expose this hidden hand without warning, to navigate the intellect and cunning of a villain even more dangerous than the one she had just captured. The room held its breath, the final act waiting to unfold, as the detective prepared to meet the true mastermind eye to eye, knowing that this revelation could change everything. The moment hung in the air, taut as a drawn bowstring. Sayers studied the figure before her, the subtle twitch of a hand, the slight tightening around the eyes, all betraying the calm exterior. This was no longer the distracted associate she had casually trusted during the earlier stages of the investigation. This was the architect of the chaos, the silent orchestrator whose manipulations had guided Penrose and missiled the authorities at every turn. "I suppose you were wondering when I would reveal myself," the figure said, voice smooth but laced with steel. Penrose was useful, but entirely replaceable. "You've been clever, Miss Sayers, but cleverness alone doesn't always guarantee victory." Sayers' gaze remained steady, her mind already racing through the layers of evidence that had led her here. She could see now how every misdirection, every subtle anomaly she had observed, was part of a deliberate pattern designed to distract and confuse. The anonymous deposits, the distorted phone calls, the timing of Penrose's actions, all of it pointed back to this individual, who had played the perfect long game. "I'm aware of your role," Sayers said evenly. "And I can assure you, it was not entirely invisible." She gestured to the symbol marked on the ledger, the same subtle insignia she had placed where it would be noticed. "Every move you made, every manipulation left a trace, one that Penrose, in his own arrogance, never thought to conceal. It is, after all, impossible to orchestrate chaos with absolute perfection." The figure's lips curved in a faint, unsettling smile. "Perhaps. But even the keenest detective can be a step behind, and you may find that some conclusions come too late." Before Sayers could respond, a sudden movement drew her attention. The back door of the room had shifted slightly, a shadow darting across the frame. It was a minor, almost imperceptible motion, yet in that instant, she realized the figure had intended a distraction, a final, desperate attempt to escape. Her heart quickened, but she did not move hastily. Every second mattered, and a misstep could allow the true mastermind to vanish before justice could be delivered. "Inspector Vane," she called, her voice calm but commanding. "Close the exits and remain vigilant. We are not finished." Vane acted instantly, sealing the entrances while Sayers maintained her focus on the figure. The tension in the room escalated, a silent duel of observation and anticipation. Every micro-expression, every flicker of hesitation, now carried immense significance. The detective had pieced together the hidden pattern, the way the villain had relied on timing, psychology, and a careful misalignment of expectations to control the narrative. Yet now, confronted directly, even the most meticulous manipulator was showing cracks. "You underestimated me," Sayers continued, her tone almost conversational, yet sharp as a blade. "Every subtle clue you left behind, the slight irregularities in handwriting, the timing of those phone calls, the selective misdirection in Penrose's narrative, each one was a thread leading to you. And I followed every single one." The figure hesitated, the first genuine pause since the confrontation began. Their eyes flickered, betraying the faintest glimmer of concern. But it was a brief hesitation. Not enough to surrender entirely. Sayers could feel the unspoken calculation should they flee, fight, or attempt some other desperate gambit. In a sudden, almost imperceptible motion, the figure made a move for the window, aiming to disappear into the night. Sayers reacted instantly, her reflexes honed by years of observation and deduction. She lunged forward, catching the edge of a coat, and pulled sharply. The figure stumbled, but in the scuffle they managed to twist free and vault through the window, disappearing into the darkness beyond. For a moment, Sayers stood frozen, the sudden emptiness of the room pressing down on her. She had uncovered the mastermind, traced the hidden pattern, and revealed the truth. Yet justice had slipped through her fingers. The villain had escaped, leaving behind an unsettling sense of unfinished business. A reminder that intelligence and cunning were not always sufficient to secure closure. Vane approached cautiously, the weight of the moment evident in his expression. They got away?" he asked, disbelief mingled with frustration. "Yes," Sayers admitted, her voice steady despite the tension. "But we have the evidence, the patterns, and the knowledge of their methods. This is not failure, it is understanding. We know who they are, what they sought, and how they orchestrated every move. And that knowledge ensures they cannot disappear completely." She returned to the papers, tracing once more the delicate lines of evidence, the clues that had been overlooked until now. She explained to Vane the significance of each detail. The anonymous deposits that had guided Penrose, the manipulated phone calls, the subtle alterations in behavior that had indicated a hand behind the scenes. Each revelation, she demonstrated, confirmed that the true villain had been in control all along, and that Penrose's role, though critical, had been only a fragment of the broader scheme. The brilliance of this case, Sayers said, her tone reflective, lies not in the crimes themselves, but in the hidden architecture behind them. Every misstep, every apparent coincidence was intentional. And yet, even in orchestrating perfection, the mastermind left traces. That is the nature of genius. It is both precise and inevitably human. Vane nodded slowly, absorbing the implications. So, even though they escaped, we have the framework to anticipate their next move. Precisely, Sayers replied. Justice, in this case, is not immediate. It is cumulative. Every observation, every deduction, every lesson learned brings us closer to ensuring the villain cannot strike again without detection. Sometimes, the appearance of escape is merely a pause, a temporary retreat before the inevitable conclusion. The room grew quiet, the tension softening but not vanishing. Sayers looked out into the dimly lit garden, imagining the figure slipping through the shadows, their escape temporary yet calculated. There was a chill in that thought, but also a sense of satisfaction, of having uncovered the hidden structure, of understanding the mind behind the chaos, and of having ensured that no detail, however subtle, would remain unseen. Returning to Vane, she summarized the case once more, carefully recounting the small yet significant clues, the misdirections, and the psychological nuances that had pointed to the true mastermind. Each revelation was a testament to her meticulous observation, her unwavering patience, and her ability to see what others could not, even in the absence of immediate justice. She had proven that intelligence and careful deduction could illuminate the darkest corners of human intent. As the night deepened, Sayers allowed herself a moment of reflection. The case had been extraordinary, not just for its complexity, but for the reminder that even the sharpest mind could be tested to its limits. The villain might have escaped into the night, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions, but the pattern, the understanding, and the clarity she had achieved were inescapable truths. And in the realm of intellect and deduction, those truths were the foundation of justice, whether immediate or delayed. Sayers knew one thing for certain. The game was not over. The villain might roam freely, but every step they took, every move they made, would be observed, analyzed, and anticipated. And when the final moment came, inevitably, they would be confronted once more, and this time escape would not be an option. Even as the night air settled around the estate, carrying the scent of damp earth and faint smoke from distant chimneys, Sayers could not shake the faint, persistent tug of unease. The case, though ostensibly concluded, clung to her mind like a shadow refusing to fade. She had uncovered the mastermind, traced the web of manipulation, and demonstrated the intricate interplay between Penrose and the true villain. But a single, nagging detail continued to elude her. The ledger she had studied so meticulously, with its subtle annotations and almost imperceptible marks, still seemed to contain one anomaly she could not yet explain. It was an errant symbol in the corner of a page. A flourish that appeared at first as a flourish of handwriting, but now felt deliberate, almost coded. She turned the pages over again, her fingers brushing lightly across the paper as if coaxing the hidden meaning to reveal itself. It was a small, seemingly insignificant mark, yet it radiated a peculiar sense of intentionality. Vane, sensing her preoccupation, approached cautiously. "You've done everything, Miss Sayers. The villain has escaped, but you have the evidence and the pattern fully laid bare. Isn't that enough?" Sayers shook her head, her eyes never leaving the ledger. "Enough is never enough, Inspector. The human mind leaves traces even when it attempts perfection. There is always a residue, a shadow of intent that can be read if one knows where to look. And in this case, I cannot ignore the residue I sense here." Her thoughts wandered back through the sequence of events, Penrose's erratic behavior, the carefully timed phone calls, the minor discrepancies in testimony, and the signature flourish of the mastermind's handiwork. Every piece fit together with remarkable precision, yet this lingering symbol seemed to suggest something further. A nuance she had not fully deciphered. As she rose from the desk, she noticed the window through which the villain had escaped. Moonlight spilled across the floor, illuminating the subtle smudges left behind, traces of hurried movement. Sayers crouched, studying the marks with a practiced eye. They hinted at direction, but also something more abstract. A deliberate misdirection, a visual echo of the calculated missteps she had traced throughout the case. Walking slowly through the quiet halls of the estate, Sayers reflected on the psychology she had uncovered. The villain's motives, as she had determined, were rooted in a blend of obsession and intellectual compulsion, a desire to orchestrate events not merely for personal gain, but for the thrill of control. And yet, even in their meticulous planning, there remained a kernel of imperfection. A single, cryptic element that could unlock a new dimension of understanding. Returning to the ledger, Sayers traced the flourish once more. She considered the possibility that it was a signature, a subtle mark meant not for the authorities, but for someone else. Or perhaps even for herself. The notion sent a shiver down her spine. Was it a taunt, a warning, or a breadcrumb leading to an entirely new mystery? Vane, standing silently nearby, observed her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "You always find something even when the case seems closed," he said. "Do you think there's more to this?" "There is always more," Sayers replied softly. "Even the most complete picture contains empty spaces. Those empty spaces are the future, possibilities, risks, and, occasionally, the faintest trace of a new puzzle waiting to be uncovered." Her gaze lingered on the moonlit horizon, where the villain had disappeared. The night was deceptively calm, yet she sensed the continuation of the game beyond the visible edges of the estate. In her mind, she reconstructed the pattern, overlaying the missing elements, imagining the next moves that might unfold. Each hypothetical scenario drew her deeper into contemplation, revealing new connections, new questions, and, inevitably, new enigmas. A soft rustle drew her attention to the desk once more. There, tucked beneath a folded envelope she had not noticed before, was a slip of paper. Its edges were frayed, and the ink was faded, yet the handwriting bore the same meticulous precision she had come to recognize. Unfolding it carefully, she read the single line: "Some games never end. Watch the shadows, and you will see the next move." Sayers' heart quickened, but not with fear. This was familiar territory, the thrill of the unseen, the intellectual challenge that transcended the immediate crime. The message was cryptic, a deliberate provocation meant to unsettle and intrigue in equal measure. It suggested that the villain, though temporarily absent, had left behind not just chaos, but a riddle, a continuing thread that might one day reveal itself fully. She held the note for a moment longer, allowing the meaning to crystallize. It was a reminder that her work was never truly complete, that the world of deduction and deception was perpetual, and that every solved case merely opened the door to the next, even when justice seemed served or narrowly evaded. The subtle machinations of human intent persisted, leaving traces for those perceptive enough to follow. Vane watched her carefully, sensing the shift in her demeanor. "You're not discouraged?" he asked. "On the contrary," she replied with a faint smile. "This is exactly why the pursuit is so compelling. Every mystery teaches something, and every unanswered question ensures that vigilance remains necessary. The case is closed in one sense, but open in another. And that, Inspector, is the essence of detection. It never truly ends." She returned the note to its hiding place, her mind already parsing the implications. Every pattern, every anomaly, every cryptic clue now had a broader significance, a potential prelude to a challenge she had yet to confront. It was both a warning and an invitation, a testament to the endless game between intellect and cunning, a reminder that the world contained layers beyond immediate perception. As dawn crept over the horizon, Sayers stepped outside, the cool morning air carrying both clarity and anticipation. She walked along the edge of the estate, the familiar landscape now tinged with the subtle thrill of unfinished business. The villain had disappeared, the immediate threat neutralized. Yet the whisper of further intrigue lingered like a shadow at the periphery of her vision. Her steps were deliberate, measured, but her mind raced with the possibilities. The cryptic flourish in the ledger, the subtle misdirection, the enigmatic note. All were pieces of a puzzle that promised more than a single resolution. Even as she left the estate behind, Sayers could feel the threads of the case stretching forward, reaching into the unknown. In that quiet, reflective moment, she understood that the pursuit of truth was perpetual. Some mysteries would conclude, yes, but others existed in layers, waiting for the keen eye to notice, the sharp mind to untangle, and the patient observer to follow the trail wherever it might lead. And for Sayers, that was both the challenge and the reward, knowing that even as one case closed, the world was never devoid of intrigue. She allowed herself a brief, satisfied smile, feeling the dual comfort and tension of a solved mystery shadowed by the promise of another. The detective's journey was never ending, the pursuit of understanding infinite, and the subtle thrill of anticipation. A whisper that the game would continue was a companion she welcomed without hesitation.